Welcome to the historic Blah, a place where the past moves very slowly, where kings wrote letters that took months to arrive, and farmers counted the seasons, one gentle sunrise at a time. Tonight we'll wander through the calm corridors of history, no wars, no drama, just the quiet turning of time. So take a deep breath, let your thoughts drift like leaves on a still pond. And if you find peace in these sleepy stories, you can like, comment, and subscribe. Not out of urgency, but simply whenever you wake up. For now, close your eyes and let history whisper you to sleep. Welcome to Beautifully Boring History. Story 1. The Boy King and the Fronde. You awaken in Paris, but this is not the Paris of the Eiffel Tower or bustling cafes. It's a city tense with unrest. The year is 1648. The Seine drifts by silently, its murky waters reflecting the gray stone of narrow alleyways. You're standing in the heart of a capital city on the edge not of greatness, but of implosion. The king is just a child. His name, Louis XIV. But at this point he is simply Louis Dieudonné, a boy of 10 who happens to sit on the throne of France not because he earned it, but because his father, Louis XIV, died young and someone had to wear the crown. The real power lies elsewhere in his mother, Anne of Austria, and her advisor, Cardinal Mazarin. But few in the city care about royal lineage today. Paris is boiling, the people are poor, bread is expensive, taxes are arbitrary. The judicial magistrates, the Parliament of Paris, are fed up with being used as tools of taxation. They want to resist. They want reform. And that's when it begins the Fronde. Not a word you hear often today. Fronde, named after a childish game played with slings, like kids might play in the alleyways. But it comes to mean something very different: civil war. A civil war that takes place not just once but in waves. Not a single conflict, but a chaotic period between 1648 and 1653 that will shape the very heart of Louis XIV's soul. The Fronde is not simply the people versus the king. It's not even clear who is fighting whom. Nobles against nobles, magistrates against ministers, Parisians against the army. Alliances shift like sand. What's clear is that the monarchy is under siege politically, physically, psychologically. In the opening days of this civil unrest, the royal family is trapped in the Louvre. Not the museum, of course, not yet. This is still a palace. Soldiers bar the doors. Rioters circle the city. A young Louis is awakened in the middle of the night and rushed through dark streets. A king fleeing his capital. At one point, they're forced to sneak out toward the countryside, cold, frightened, and unsure of their return. Imagine it. A 10-year-old king wrapped in a blanket held close to his mother as carriage wheels jolt over muddy roads. Firelight flickers in the distance. Behind them, Paris burns in rage. In front of them, uncertainty. And the irony, the Fronde was not even truly aimed at young Louis. Not at first. He was symbolic, but symbols are powerful. What he experienced during these chaotic years would never leave him. These formative nights of fear would mold him into the absolutist. He would become the Sun King who would centralize power so completely that no rebellion could threaten him again. But let's pause here. What exactly caused the Fronde? To understand this, we must pull back beyond the palace walls into the broader fabric of 17th century French society. Recite the seeds of revolt. France in 1648 is broke. The 30 Years' War, though winding down, has drained the royal treasury. To finance the war, Mazarin and Anne imposed taxes without much consultation. Judges in the Parliament of Paris, an elite body meant to register royal laws, began to resist these financial decrees. The judicial elite wasn't radical. They were wealthy, conservative, and legalistic, but they hated being treated as rubber stamps. They wanted something very French: to preserve their privileges. No taxation without deliberation. No encroachments on their traditional rights. The people in the streets, however, were less nuanced. For them, the Fronde wasn't about legal theory. It was about food, rent, survival. And when barricades went up in the streets, literal piles of garbage, carts, stones, and beams, the Fronde became real. Louis learns to watch and wait. During these early years of the Fronde, sometimes called the Fronde of the Parlement, Louis watched from exile as Paris unraveled. He didn't yet wield power, but he observed. When the monarchy regained control in 1651, Louis returned to Paris in what should have been a moment of triumph, but his heart was hardening. Historians often say Louis XIV never forgave the Fronde, but what does that mean? He wasn't a man prone to vengeance. He was, however, obsessed with order. He craved predictability, hierarchy, and the visible signs of dominance. It's not hard to see how these obsessions grew from his earliest memories. Armed men threatening his family, nobles switching sides in the night, and political legitimacy seemingly dissolving. These were not lessons forgotten. They were imprinted. The mirror of fear. So many of the strange, ritualistic, and almost theatrical aspects of Louis's later rule, his performance of kingship at Versailles, his obsession with etiquette, his insistence on personal oversight, these are often read as vanity. But perhaps they were something else, a shield, a system. What if they were designed not for beauty or glory, but for survival? What if Louis XIV's absolutism wasn't born from arrogance, but from childhood fear? Candle, and so we end this section with a boy who will become a king, and a king who will one day become a god, or at least insist on being treated like one. But in these quiet, cold corridors of exile, we see the seed planted. The Fronde was more than rebellion, it was trauma. And trauma leaves marks. But what happened when that boy took the crown in his own right and decided never again to let chaos rule? The year is 1651. Louis is now 13 years old, and in theory he has just come of age. But in practice, power still rests with Cardinal Mazarin. The Cardinal, Italian by birth, French by ambition, remains at the helm of France's fragile monarchy. And young Louis, he watches, he studies, he endures. This is a France still emerging from the flames of civil strife. The first phase of the Fronde, the so-called Fronde of the Parlement, had been about lawyers and tax grievances. But the second phase, the Fronde of the Princes, is something more dangerous. The high nobility, once loyal or at least obedient, has realized its own power. Princes, dukes, and marshals raise private armies, court foreign support, and make open war against the monarchy. And Louis, not yet the Sun King, walks through a court riddled with uncertainty. Who is truly loyal? Who is biding their time? It is one thing to imagine absolutism as a simple power grab. But in Louis's world, absolutism wasn't the ambition of a spoiled prince, it was a shield against disintegration. What he saw was this, that without iron control, everything unraveled. We explore how Louis's childhood shaped his evolving sense of kingship. Not merely symbolic, not distant but personal, involved and total. Mantelpiece, the court without a center. Mazarin was not loved. He was cunning, capable, and tireless, but he was seen as a foreigner and worse, a manipulator. His style of rule, while effective in some ways, lacked the visible authority the court craved. In the minds of many nobles, France was being run by a shadow. By 1652, Paris had once again descended into revolt. The Prince of Condé, a brilliant military leader and royal cousin, had turned on the court. He gathered troops, allies, and public sympathy. The conflict spread beyond the capital into the provinces, with towns choosing sides as if the nation were in a permanent state of civil war. The monarchy's authority was unsteady. In one striking episode, the royal family had to flee Paris again, this time with Condé's forces threatening to march on the city. The capital had become a place of pamphlets, barricades, and shifting loyalties. And all the while, Louis was learning. He watched as Mazarin returned to exile, and then triumphantly came back. He watched how alliances shifted, how the Parlement of Paris claimed to defend liberties, yet consistently undermined order. He observed how noble families who once begged favors from the king could become enemies overnight. In this instability, a deep conviction took root. France needed a center, a constant, a sun around which all must orbit. Building the philosophy of absolutism begins to form. It's important to remember that Louis XIV was not yet the philosophical autocrat he would later become. But during this phase of his life, his teens and early 20s, the soil was tilled. He began to absorb certain key principles. That the nobility could not be trusted to govern independently. That public assemblies like the Parliament were prone to self-interest and obstruction. That order, not consensus, must be the foundation of royal rule. These ideas didn't emerge in isolation. They were part of a broader European trend. Across the continent, monarchs were beginning to assert more centralized control. In Spain, Austria, and even England, though temporarily under a republic, the tension between crown and assembly was a defining issue. But in France, the memory of the Fronde made that tension personal. Crown Louis becomes king, but not yet ruler. In 1654, at the age of 15, Louis was formally crowned at Reims Cathedral. It was a magnificent, ritual-laden affair. Yet, even after this sacred moment, he did not immediately take the reins of government. That task still belonged to Mazarin, who remained chief minister until his death in 1661. Some have suggested that Louis was lazy during these years, more interested in hunting, dancing, and courtly entertainments than the burdens of state. But this is likely a misreading. Louis was watching, learning, and waiting. He attended council meetings. He reviewed documents. He observed how Mazarin navigated the complexities of governance. And crucially, he saw how resentment simmered beneath the surface. Scroll the aftermath of the Fronde, of France in need of structure. By 1653, the Fronde was effectively over. Condé was in exile. Mazarin had returned victorious, but the damage was done. The royal finances were in shambles. Public confidence in the crown had been weakened. The nobles, chastened but still proud, had lost much of their influence. The idea of a monarchy dependent on noble cooperation had been shattered. This is the world Louis inherits. To truly understand his later policies, the construction of Versailles, the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, the endless wars, the control of the arts, the centralization of law and taxation, one must begin here. In a France desperate for unity, the Fronde had proven that a decentralized system could lead to chaos. Louis would build a new system, one based not on consensus or shared power, but on visibility, routine, and hierarchy. Mazarin's death and the silence that follows. In March of 1661, Cardinal Mazarin dies. And something extraordinary happens. Louis, now 22 years old, gathers his council. The ministers expect what always happens, the appointment of a new chief minister. Perhaps Colbert, perhaps Letellier, perhaps someone from the clergy. But instead, Louis announces something shocking. I will be my own first minister. A pause, silence. He means it. From that day forward, Louis attends council meetings every single day. He reads every document. He signs every order. No decision is made without his oversight. It is not a theatrical gesture. It is the beginning of the most famous absolute monarchy in European history. Performing arts, the dawn of personal rule. With Mazarin gone, Louis begins the work of reordering the kingdom, not through sweeping reforms at first, but through structure, predictability, ceremony. He begins crafting the daily rhythm of kingship. He will wake at the same time, hold council at the same hour, walk through his gardens on a schedule, eat publicly, bathe publicly, even dress publicly. These aren't acts of vanity, they are acts of control. His courtiers begin to revolve around him like planets. Rank is measured in proximity. Who holds the candlestick, who hands him his shirt, who may speak during his meal. It seems trivial, and in many ways it is, but it serves a purpose. It locks the nobility into ritual, not rebellion. This transformation does not happen overnight, but it begins here, in the quiet days after Mazarin's death, in a world recently torn apart by civil strife. And through it all, Louis remembers the barricades, the whispers, the cold nights of exile. He remembers the feeling of being a powerless king. He will not feel that again. Brain absolutism as memory, not just method. It's easy to discuss absolutism as an abstract theory, the divine right of kings, the rejection of checks and balances. But for Louis XIV, it was more than doctrine. It was autobiography. To him, chaos had a name, the Fronde. Absolutism, then, was not just power, it was prevention. By centralizing the military, the bureaucracy, the clergy, the arts, even time itself, Louis sought to eliminate variables, to compress France into a single, controlled sphere. One mind, one will, one source of light. And so we end this section with a young king who has just taken the reins of power, not with thunderous proclamations, but with silence, structure, and attention. He has survived rebellion. He has buried his advisor. And now he begins the quiet revolution of routine that will define his reign. But what happens when a king not only takes power, but builds an entire world around himself? What happens when the state really does become the king? By the early 1660s, Louis XIV is no longer the boy king. He is not even a mere monarch. He is a man who survived civil war, who buried his first minister, and who now holds the reins of a fractured kingdom with quiet intensity. But something profound is happening. He is not just consolidating power, he is shaping reality itself. In this final section of our story, we see the transition from king to icon, from ruler to symbol, from Louis the man to Louis the Sun King. The Fronde was his crucible. Now he begins to build his monument not in stone alone, but in structure, ritual, and memory. Let us walk through it together. The invention of the sun. Louis did not randomly choose the sun as his symbol. The sun is eternal, central, immovable. Its gravity governs the movement of all things. It shines equally on all, and yet it is untouchable. In ballet, one of Louis's earliest artistic passions, the sun was a classical emblem of harmony and power. As a teenager, Louis had performed the lead role in a court ballet titled Le Ballet de la Nuit, the Ballet of the Night, where he appeared at dawn as Apollo, the sun god. Draped in golden rays, he descended to bring light and order to a world of darkness and confusion. It was symbolic, it was theatrical, and it was unforgettable. From then on, Louis would adopt the sun as his personal emblem, not only as a reflection of majesty, but as a direct statement of his philosophy. The king does not merely rule France. The king is France. As he later put it simply, "L'état c'est moi." I am the state. Versailles, the geometry of power. The king needed a stage worthy of his son. Paris was out of the question. It was unruly. It had betrayed him during the Fronde. Louis would never forget how the capital had become a prison, how he had been forced to flee through alleyways while mobs shouted at his carriage. So he chose Versailles, a hunting lodge outside the city, quiet, controlled, expandable. Construction began in earnest in the 1660s, but Versailles was not just a palace, it was a political instrument. Every hallway, garden, and salon was designed to center around the king. The architecture itself obeyed his symbolism, radiating outward like sunbeams. At Versailles, Louis created a court culture based on ritual and surveillance. Nobles were invited, or rather, compelled to live near him, not for their advice, but for their obedience. There, under chandeliers and mirrored halls, they competed not in governance, but in etiquette. Who would hold the king's sleeve as he dressed? Who would be permitted to hand him water? Who would be invited to watch him dine? It was absurd, but it worked. Politics through performance. Every moment of the king's day from waking to sleeping was choreographed. These rituals were not just vanity. They were the currency of power. To be near the king was to matter. To be excluded was political death. This was absolutism by performance. The court became a place of competition over access. Instead of conspiring in distant provinces, the nobility was now trapped in a gilded cage, one they didn't even realize they were in. And Louis, he never stopped watching. He read reports from every corner of the kingdom. He signed thousands of documents. He personally reviewed military promotions and tax decisions. His involvement was not superficial, it was total. A bureaucracy built in his image. One of the most boring but significant outcomes of Louis's absolutism was the growth of a professional, centralized bureaucracy. He empowered men like Jean-Baptiste Colbert, who reorganized the economy, streamlined tax collection, and reinforced royal authority in trade and industry. Colbert established royal manufacturing monopolies, fostered colonial trade, and enforced mercantilist policies, all in the king's name. Louis's ministers were not powerful nobles but skilled administrators, loyal only to him. Many were of modest backgrounds. Their status came from royal favor, not birth. France became a country where you could rise if you served the crown. The old feudal networks that had empowered local aristocracy were replaced by a lattice of intendants, royal officials who enforced central policy in the provinces. These men were Louis's eyes and ears. They collected data, enforced orders, and bypassed local lords. The message was clear: the king sees everything. Divine right and the control of conscience. To further reinforce his legitimacy, Louis leaned on theology. The doctrine of the divine right of kings was not new, but under Louis it was actively broadcast. Bishops were expected to preach that obedience to the king was obedience to God. In schools and churches, children were taught not only religion but loyalty. Louis wasn't just a political leader, he was a sacred figure, a chosen agent of divine order. This brings us to one of the most controversial acts of his reign, the revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685. This edict, originally issued by Henry IV in 1598, had granted French Protestants, the Huguenots, limited religious freedom. Louis saw it as a compromise that fragmented national unity. So he revoked it. Protestant churches were closed, schools were shut down, thousands of Huguenots were forced to convert or flee. The country lost many skilled artisans, merchants, and intellectuals. Entire regions emptied. Why did he do it? To us, it seems intolerant, even self-destructive. But to Louis, religious diversity equaled division, and division was a threat. The Fronde had shown that cracks in unity could lead to collapse. Uniformity, even if harsh, meant control. Absolutism and endless war. Of course, absolutism was not only domestic. Louis extended his ambitions across Europe. The Fronde had left France inwardly shaken but outwardly intact. Its army was professionalizing. Its economy, under Colbert, was expanding. And Louis wanted grandeur. He launched wars first over small territorial claims, like the War of Devolution in 1667, then larger conflicts, like the Franco-Dutch War, and later, the War of the League of Augsburg and the War of the Spanish Succession. These wars consumed the second half of his reign. They drained the treasury, they strained the population, but they also extended France's cultural and political footprint. Louis built an image of France as the cultural and military capital of Europe. French became the language of diplomacy. French architecture, fashion, and art set the standard for courts across the continent. Even enemies of France could not resist its style. The legacy of control. By the time Louis XIV died in 1715, after 72 years on the throne, He had outlived nearly everyone who had opposed or served him. He had turned France into a centralized, bureaucratized, and militarized state. But at what cost? In the short term, France basked in glory, Versailles dazzled, the arts flourished, royal authority seemed unshakable. But underneath the surface, resentment grew. The nobility, tamed but idle, yearned for relevance. The common people, burdened by taxes and conscription, suffered. Protestants were gone. Intellectuals began whispering of reason and liberty. A century later, a different crowd would storm a different royal palace. The Sun King had created a model of power so absolute that it left no room for flexibility or forgiveness. Candle final reflection, from boy to son. And so we return to the boy in the carriage, the cold streets of Paris, the distant firelight of rebellion. That night never left him. Louis XIV's absolutism was not just about ego. It was about fear turned into structure. It was about chaos turned into routine. It was about ensuring that never again would a king of France be awakened in terror and forced to flee his own capital. In the end, Louis XIV did not merely rule his country. He organized it. He ritualized it. He captured it in architecture, in bureaucracy, in dance, in silence. He did what he believed he had to do. But the question lingers, did he build a system that would outlast him, or a prison that no one could escape? Story 2. Versailles building a palace, controlling a nobility. The Palace of Versailles stands today as a symbol of opulence, all mirrors and marble, fountains and formality. Tourists shuffle through its halls, marveling at the grandeur. Gold glints on every surface. The Hall of Mirrors reflects more than light. It reflects power. A power so absolute that even its architecture demands submission. But before Versailles became the beating heart of absolutism, it was something quite different. A modest hunting lodge surrounded by marsh and forest, unassuming, secluded, damp. This section is not about Versailles as we remember it but as it began. Not yet a palace, but an idea born not of luxury, but of fear, strategy, and control. The lodge in the marsh. Let us go back to 1623. Young Louis XIV, father of the future Sun King, builds a small brick and stone hunting lodge near the village of Versailles, some 20 kilometers southwest of Paris. It's remote, surrounded by forest teeming with wild boar and deer. There is no symbolism here, no intention of grandeur. This is a place to hunt, to escape, to breathe. Yet the location would prove fateful. Years later, when Louis XIV returns as king, he remembers this place, not just for its game, but for its distance from the city, from its politics, from its mobs. The memory of the Fronde, of being hounded through the streets of Paris, of court nobles whispering behind closed doors, was still raw. Louis wanted not only a retreat, he wanted to remove the court from its old centers of power entirely. Versailles offered isolation, and in that isolation, control. Hammer construction begins, not splendor but strategy. In 1661, following the death of Cardinal Mazarin and the beginning of Louis's personal rule, construction at Versailles resumed. But this was not yet the Versailles of fountains and gold. In its early years, the expansion was practical. The marshland was drained. Gardens were laid out. Accommodations were made for the king's entourage. But from the very beginning, Louis approached Versailles not simply as a residence but as a system. He wanted a place where nobles could be watched, where ministers could be summoned at will, and where the rhythms of life revolved around his presence. It would not be finished in a year, or 10. In fact, Louis would spend over 4 decades refining it, adding wings, building fountains, planting trees, replanting trees, changing designs midway through. It would become the longest construction project of his reign, and perhaps the most important. Classical architecture as authority. Versailles is not just large, it is ordered. The layout of the palace and gardens follows strict geometric logic: long, straight sightlines, balanced proportions, radiating paths. There is no mystery, no winding alleys like those in Paris. Everything points to one place: the central room, the bedchamber of the king. Even the sun, in the symbolic language of Versailles, rises and sets in concert with Louis. The entire palace is laid out to emphasize the centrality of his person. It is a metaphor made stone. The state radiates outward from the monarch. This architectural absolutism extended beyond the palace. Louis ordered the replanting of vast forests. He diverted water from rivers miles away to supply the fountains, an engineering feat that required thousands of laborers. Nothing was left to chance. Even nature would obey the king. Person walking the nobility comes to Versailles. In the early years of construction, Versailles was not particularly comfortable. It was damp in winter, stifling in summer, and the stench of open latrines filled the air. But still, the nobility came. They had to. Louis issued no formal decree compelling them. He didn't need to. Access to the king meant access to patronage, titles, pensions, marriages, favors. To be absent was to be forgotten. To be forgotten was political death. So the great families of France abandoned their ancestral chateaux and set up residence at Versailles. Some were given rooms in the palace. Others rented nearby lodgings and vied for favor. Versailles became the only game in town. And Louis, he watched them all. Rituals and routines, the invisible chains. One of the most misunderstood aspects of Versailles is its ceremony. Yes, the king rose at a set time. Yes, he ate in public. Yes, nobles fought for the right to hand him his gloves or hold the candle during bedtime. But these rituals were not absurd to them. They were opportunities. By controlling access, Louis controlled ambition. He tied noble status not to land or military power, but to closeness. You could spend your entire career trying to earn the right to pour his wine. This was not eccentricity. It was psychological mastery. Receipt bureaucracy by design. While the nobles were busy with dances, duels, and etiquette, Louis quietly built a centralized state. Ministers like Colbert operated behind the scenes, creating networks of tax collectors, inspectors, and intendants all loyal to the crown. Versailles became the visible face of monarchy. The real work happened behind its mirrors. And the nobles, for all their titles and ancestry, they had been defanged, distracted, absorbed into a ritual machine. Louis didn't abolish the aristocracy. He reprogrammed it. Artist palette art, theater, and symbolic warfare. Versailles was not only a political instrument, it was cultural propaganda. Louis sponsored painters, playwrights, composers, architects. The arts were not merely encouraged, they were curated. The king himself decided what themes would be emphasized. Painters depicted him as a Roman emperor. Sculptors immortalized his victories. Poets compared him to the sun. Playwrights like Molière produced comedies at court, sometimes poking fun at courtiers, but never at the crown. This was not patronage for its own sake. It was warfare, symbolic warfare. Through the arts, Louis projected his image across Europe. He became more than a man. He became a myth. The cost of glory. By the late 1680s, Versailles had grown into the largest palace in Europe. It could house thousands. Its gardens sprawled for miles. Its fountains, sometimes spraying dozens of jets into the air, were coordinated by teams of workers who watched the king's position and turned on valves accordingly so that the water would dance only where Louis walked. But the cost? Staggering. The annual maintenance of Versailles consumed vast portions of the royal budget. Wars were sometimes fought with fewer resources than what was spent illuminating a ball or building a new wing. Yet Louis insisted on it. Because Versailles was not a luxury. It was the system itself. And so we end this. In the center of a palace that began as a lodge and became a world where the king is not merely present, he is everywhere. In stone, in glass, in gardens, in ceremony. But what happens when the control becomes too tight? When the nobles, once wild, begin to wither under watchful eyes? When the cost of brilliance starts to bend the backbone of the state? Can a palace built for power avoid becoming a prison? You rise early. The sun has not yet crested the horizon, but already the palace stirs. The servants move silently down corridors lit by flickering candles. Courtiers shift in their beds, wondering if today will be their day, the day they are noticed, remembered, or invited. You are not in a city. You are not in a government building. You are in Versailles, and everything from the moment you wake to the food you eat to the expression on your face is part of a quiet, invisible competition. This is not just a palace. It is a mechanism of power, and you are one of its moving parts. Welcome to life in the gilded cage. Mantelpiece, the ritualized day. The schedule was not merely strict, it was sacred. 8:00 a.m. the lever begins. The king rises from bed. Only a select group of courtiers, nobles of appropriate rank, are permitted to attend. One hands him his robe. Another may present his wig. These are not errands. They are honors. 10:00 a.m. Mass. All are expected to attend. Not for devotion, though that too is appreciated, but because the king is there. Presence is performance. Midday the king dines, often in public. Courtiers line the walls, watching. Silence reigns, except for the clinking of silverware and the soft voice of the king speaking only when he chooses. Afternoon audiences, hunts, walks in the garden, all choreographed, all observed. Evening the coucher. The king retires. Again select nobles are present. Again each gesture is symbolic. To outsiders, it seems absurd, even theatrical. But inside this palace, these gestures are how power is distributed, not through laws or decrees, but through access. Eye surveillance in silk. Versailles had no prisons. It had no police force patrolling its gilded halls. But make no mistake, this was a place of surveillance. Not the surveillance of locked doors or iron bars, but of visibility. Everything was seen, everyone was watching. A misplaced comment, a joke at the wrong moment, a misstep during a dance. These things mattered. They were recorded in memory, in whispers, in the king's perception. Louis didn't need to threaten the nobility with violence. He held something far more valuable: prestige. A noble who fell out of favor lost more than comfort. He lost influence, invitations, pensions, appointments. He was, for all intents and purposes, erased. Mirrors and illusions. One of the palace's most famous features is the Hall of Mirrors, a vast gallery lined with reflective glass, where diplomats were received, treaties signed, and ceremonies performed. But mirrors were not simply decoration. They were symbolic. At Versailles, nothing was private. Even your reflection could be seen by others. The space multiplied the king's image endlessly. He did not need to be present to be felt. The message was clear: the king sees all. Brain etiquette as weapon. Louis XIV developed, or rather codified, a court etiquette so complex, so detailed, that mastering it became a full-time pursuit. There were rules for everything. How deep to bow, when to speak, where to stand, what to wear and how to wear it. Dress was not self-expression. It was obligation. Men and women spent fortunes keeping up with changing fashions, sometimes impoverishing themselves just to remain acceptable at court. And this was not a side effect. It was intentional. By turning nobility into fashion, gesture, and ritual, Louis emptied it of political power. Receipt from warriors to courtiers. Consider what the French nobility once was. Before Louis's time, great lords commanded armies. They ruled provinces. They minted coins, raised taxes, and held private courts. They were the state in their own territories. But by the late 17th century, these same nobles were engaged in arguments over seating charts. The king had replaced political power with ceremonial status. He didn't destroy the nobility, he seduced it. They had titles, prestige, proximity, but no agency. The nobles became ornaments of the state, not architects of it. Money bagged the hidden cost of court life. Living at Versailles was expensive, deliberately so. Apartments were assigned by rank and favor. Maintenance was often at the noble's own cost. Gifts to the king, parties, clothing, horses, and jewelry all expected, none cheap. Yet few dared to leave. Why? Because Versailles was more than a residence. It was a stage, and being seen was everything. A noble who left for their provincial estate might regain comfort, but they would lose visibility. And in Louis's France, visibility was survival. So they stayed, they borrowed, they spent, they competed. And Louis watched. Who didn't fall for it? Not everyone was seduced. Some older aristocrats grumbled. They missed the days of decisive battles, real influence, and provincial autonomy. A few even attempted resistance, staying away, criticizing the system, refusing to grovel. But they quickly found themselves marginalized. Without the king's favor, their access to government was gone. Their children received no appointments. Their influence shrank. Even military commissions, once hereditary or purchased, now flowed from Versailles. To oppose the palace was to remove yourself from the state. And few were willing to pay that price. Globe showing Europe, Africa, Versailles as a diplomatic tool. Foreign ambassadors who visited Versailles were stunned and overwhelmed. They were received with lavish ceremony. They were escorted through glittering galleries. They were made to wait in elaborate antechambers, watching as lesser nobles fawned over the king. It was not just hospitality. It was psychological warfare. Every moment at Versailles reinforced the idea that France was the center of the world and Louis its axis. Some diplomats came away impressed, others intimidated, but none walked away unaware of France's power or the king's dominance. Patronage as leverage. One of the key ways Louis exercised control was through patronage. He distributed titles, pensions, abbeys, military commands, and court offices with meticulous care. Nothing was automatic. Everything was a favor. This made the court dependent. Even the greatest noble families had to compete for royal largesse. They could not rely on inheritance or tradition. They had to serve the system, attend the rituals, flatter the ministers, obey the protocols. In doing so, they traded autonomy for security. And slowly, without realizing it, they surrendered the last of their independence. Buck's Louis's Invisible Revolution. Louis XIV did not hold mass executions. He did not purge the nobility with terror or confiscation. He didn't need to. He changed the function of nobility without declaring it. He made them symbols of power instead of sources of it. And he did it with politeness, precision, and performance. That's the genius of Versailles. It wasn't a fortress. It was a filter. Only those willing to submit to the rhythm of the court passed through. And by the time they did, they had become something new. Something harmless. Candle, and so we end this section. With a court full of jewels and gestures, silks and smiles, where power is not seized, but softly surrendered. Where the nobles still wear their titles, but no longer wield their swords. They live in gold-trimmed apartments. They dine under chandeliers. They laugh during operas. But outside the gates, the real France churns. Peasants toil, soldiers march, taxes rise. So we ask, what happens when a system built to tame the elite forgets the people beneath them? It is the year 1700. Louis XIV has ruled for nearly 6 decades. Versailles gleams like the jewel of France. The gardens are trimmed to mathematical perfection. The fountains rise and fall with calculated elegance. Courtiers glide across marbled floors, draped in lace and protocol. To an outsider, this is a golden age. But beneath the polished floors and mirrored halls, the foundation begins to shift, quietly, almost invisibly. The court is magnificent and disconnected. The nobility is contained and hollow. The machinery of Versailles continues to turn, but fewer hands are on the real levers of the kingdom. In this final section, we watch Versailles at its apex, and we listen closely for the first sounds of fracture. The palace becomes the state. By the early 18th century, Versailles was no longer merely a residence or a royal project, it was the monarchy. Everything revolved around it. State decisions were made in its chambers. Diplomacy was conducted in its salons. Art, music, and language were produced and approved within its walls. French became the lingua franca of European diplomacy, not because of France's armies, but because of Versailles' cultural magnetism. Poets, musicians, scholars all hoped to bask in the king's reflected light. And within this self-contained world, the king reigned supreme. Yet paradoxically, the tighter the control, the more isolated the system became from the rest of France. Chart decreasing the nobility's gradual decline. Versailles had achieved its purpose. The nobles were neutralized. They no longer raised armies. They no longer resisted policy. They no longer served as regional powers. But what were they now? They were, in truth, ceremonial functionaries. Some still held military commands or provincial titles, but their actual power, their ability to act independently, had atrophied. Years spent mastering etiquette had dulled their edge. Their estates neglected, their debts mounting, their children increasingly dependent on royal favor for advancement. Even marriages became transactions, matches made not for land or legacy, but for position at court. Louis had created not a ruling elite, but a spectator class. Balanced power shifts to the bureaucrats. While nobles performed rituals, a new class of men rose quietly, bureaucrats. Often born into the bourgeoisie, trained in law, finance, or administration, these men had no titles, only competence. They ran the tax system. They managed supply chains. They oversaw colonial interests, censuses, censures, infrastructure. Their loyalty was to the king, not to lineage. They did not need to dance at Versailles. Their influence came through paper, not pomp. This was the real transformation of France under Louis XIV. The administrative state emerged from behind the curtains of court. The nobles didn't notice or didn't care, but the people did. The growing weight of taxation. Maintaining Versailles with its constant expansions, theatrical spectacles, and thousands of residents cost money, colossal sums. And the money had to come from somewhere. But Louis never established a tax system that fairly distributed the burden. The nobility and clergy were largely exempt. The real cost fell upon peasants, who paid direct taxes on land and labor. Urban workers, who paid indirect taxes on goods like salt, wine, and flour. The emerging bourgeoisie, who found themselves squeezed between obligations and limited influence. Over time, resentment grew. Not always openly, but steadily. The contrast between the glittering court and the grim realities of provincial France became harder to ignore. Compass Versailles and the rest of France, a growing divide. Imagine a peasant from Normandy or Languedoc arriving at Versailles, if such a journey were even permitted. He would see gold leaf on every surface, tables filled with exotic fruits and fine wine, nobles arguing about ribbon length or hat feathers, and a king who walked only among mirrors. What he would not see: his own hunger, his family's unpaid debts, his village's collapsed bridge, or the local tax collector's cruelty. Versailles was never meant to reflect the lives of ordinary people. But by the turn of the 18th century, the distance between appearance and reality had become a chasm. Crossed the wars that weakened the crown. Louis's ambition was not confined to the palace. His foreign policy, bold and aggressive, had plunged France into repeated wars. Some were victories, others Pyrrhic. The War of the Spanish Succession, 1701–1714, would prove especially costly. France fought to secure a Bourbon heir to the Spanish throne, hoping to unite two great kingdoms. But the conflict drained the treasury, decimated the army, and left France isolated diplomatically. The toll on the people was devastating: famine, debt, military conscription, economic collapse in some regions. At Versailles, the operas continued, but across France, bells tolled for the dead and for the dying faith in royal grandeur. Hourglass not done old age, mourning and reflection. As Louis aged, the tone of the court darkened. He lost heirs: his son, his grandson, his great-grandson, all in the span of a few years, one after another, taken by illness or war. His beloved wife, Maria Theresa, had long since died. His secret second wife, Madame de Maintenon, grew increasingly pious and withdrawn. The once vibrant halls of Versailles grew more somber. And the king, he too seemed to reflect more deeply. He attended more religious services. He spoke more often of legacy and of warning. In 1715, on his deathbed, Louis reportedly said, "Do not follow the bad example I have set you. I have loved war too much." It was an extraordinary admission, quiet, almost whispered. But the truth had crept in. Versailles was majestic, but France was exhausted. Scroll the system he left behind. When Louis XIV died at the age of 76, the court was stunned and yet unprepared. He had ruled so long, no one else remembered life without him. But the machinery he had built did not vanish. Versailles continued, the rituals remained, the nobility stayed in place. Yet the cracks were there. A bloated aristocracy with no purpose. A middle class burdened and voiceless. A bureaucracy powerful but resented. A peasantry taxed to the edge of survival. Louis had unified France. He had glorified the monarchy. He had transformed power into performance. But he had also removed the nobility from the provinces, ignored the cries of the people, and built a palace so beautiful that it blinded its own builders. Candle final reflection: the palace and the price. Versailles still stands. Tourists wander its halls, students sketch its fountains, diplomats occasionally gather under its chandeliers. But it is also a symbol of what happens when power becomes performance, when control becomes spectacle, and when rulers mistake ritual for reality. Louis XIV began with a hunting lodge and a dream. He ended with the most elaborate court in European history, and a nation beginning to strain under its own illusions. He had tamed the nobility, but he had ignored the future. And so we ask, as the golden gates of Versailles close behind us, can a palace truly rule a country, or must every mirror eventually reflect what it refuses to see? Story 3. Colbert's Ledger: the machinery of royal finance. While nobles preened and the king performed his rituals beneath chandeliers, another kind of man worked by candlelight. His fingers stained with ink, not wine. His power measured in numbers, not ceremonies. His weapons, ledgers, tariffs, and decimal points. His name was Jean-Baptiste Colbert. If Louis XIV was the Sun King, Colbert was his shadow, diligent, precise, and relentless. Behind the marble of Versailles lay the scaffolding of the French state. Colbert built it, not with poetry or powder, but with spreadsheets of an age before spreadsheets existed. This is not a story of swords or salons. It is a story of balance sheets, bureaucracy, and ambition. and in many ways it is the story of how absolutism truly functioned. Because a king cannot rule without money. Origins of a bureaucrat. Jean-Baptiste Colbert was born in 1619, the son of a modest family of merchants in Reims. Unlike the nobles who came to Versailles seeking titles, Colbert had no inherited grandeur. He had numbers, he had focus, and he had a deep belief that France and its king could be made richer, stronger, and more efficient. He entered royal service in the 1640s during the upheavals of the Fronde. Quietly, methodically, he attached himself to Cardinal Mazarin, then later to Louis XIV himself. He did not dazzle, he delivered. In 1661, when Mazarin died and Louis took the reins of power, he noticed Colbert. The young king, eager to control his realm, needed someone who could make the state work like a machine. And Colbert, he offered not dreams but order. Scroll the mess he inherited. France's finances in 1661 were, in a word, disastrous. Decades of war had drained the treasury. Corruption was rampant. Tax farming, a system where private individuals bought the right to collect taxes and kept a portion, led to widespread abuse. Money disappeared before it reached the king's coffers. Regions reported false figures. Local nobles negotiated exceptions. The tax system was unequal, inefficient, and opaque. Colbert didn't flinch. He created audits, he summoned accountants, he pored over numbers. In one famous act, he audited Nicolas Fouquet, the powerful superintendent of finances, and exposed him. Fouquet had built a magnificent estate, Vaux-le-Vicomte, and thrown a lavish party in the king's honor. Louis was unimpressed. Colbert saw an opportunity. Fouquet was arrested, his assets seized, and from that moment forward, Colbert assumed control. Reforming the tax system. Colbert understood that absolutism required reliable revenue, so he attacked the inefficiencies head-on. His reforms included reducing tax farming in favor of direct collection, creating a centralized financial bureaucracy, answerable only to the king, standardizing weights, measures, and coinage to prevent regional abuse, investigating and punishing fraud even among the elite. But there was a limit. Colbert did not reform the tax privileges of the nobility or clergy. These groups remained largely exempt. The result, the Third Estate, the peasants, urban workers, and commoners continued to carry the greatest burden. Colbert accepted this injustice not out of malice, but out of political realism. The monarchy depended on noble support. Better to increase efficiency than provoke rebellion. Bricks Colbertism, the blueprint of absolutist economy. Colbert's economic philosophy has a name, Colbertism, a variant of mercantilism. Its core idea, the wealth of a nation is finite, and it must be controlled, directed, and protected by the state. This meant encouraging domestic manufacturing to avoid imports, creating state-sponsored industries, textiles, glass, shipbuilding, establishing royal monopolies in key sectors, providing subsidies and tax breaks to favored producers, building infrastructure, roads, canals, ports to link the kingdom. He believed that France should produce everything it needed and export its excess to dominate international markets. He also introduced protective tariffs to discourage imports. Foreign goods became more expensive. French goods were favored. To Colbert, trade was war by other means. Passenger, the navy, and colonies. Colbert also believed in projecting power not only on land but at sea. He poured money into building a modern navy. Shipyards sprang up along the coasts. New ports were developed. Officers were trained. Ship designs improved. Why? Because trade required protection, and colonies in the Caribbean, in North America, in Africa were seen as vital to French prestige and wealth. Under Colbert's direction, the Company of the East Indies, and Company of the West Indies were reorganized. Settlements in Canada, Louisiana, and Saint-Domingue, now Haiti, were expanded. Trade in sugar, fur, tobacco, and enslaved people grew under the grim logic of profit. Colbert believed that overseas wealth could fund the state, elevate the king, and keep France competitive with England and the Dutch Republic. But these ventures were expensive, fragile, and often ethically appalling, especially as they relied heavily on the Atlantic slave trade. A bureaucratic revolution. One of Colbert's quietest but most lasting contributions was bureaucracy. He introduced uniform record-keeping across ministries, the use of statistical surveys to gather data on agriculture, population, industry, a new Cadastre A land survey for assessing property taxes. He even developed tables listing the financial value of different types of land and labor, an early form of economic modeling. He believed that a well-governed state must be legible, that the king should be able to see and quantify his kingdom. It was a radical idea that data could govern. Today we might call it technocracy. In Colbert's time it was unprecedented. And so we end this section. Not with a parade, but with a pen scratching paper by candlelight. Colbert was no general, no courtier, no poet, but he was the organizer of absolutism. He built the pipes that carried gold to Versailles, the ledgers that legitimized power, the rules that shaped an economy in the king's image. But for all his genius, his system rested on a contradiction. How do you modernize a kingdom while preserving ancient privileges? And as his reforms deepened, as revenues climbed and factories grew, he could not escape a rising question. What happens when those who pay the most also begin to demand a voice? Imagine a kingdom where the taxes are collected with discipline, the roads are paved with purpose, and the ships in the harbors carry more goods than weapons. At the helm of this transformation stands not a noble, not a war hero, but a bookkeeper, a master of margins and margins of error. Jean-Baptiste Colbert, first Minister of Finances under Louis XIV, has begun to transform France from a patchwork of privilege into a system of organized revenue and centralized control. But it is not yet a modern state, and Colbert is not a revolutionary. In this section, we follow the limits of Colbert's reforms, how he expanded the reach of absolutism through innovation, and yet remained trapped by its oldest traditions. We peer into the cracks of a system meant to be fair, but built on unfairness, efficient yet fundamentally unequal. This is the story of a man trying to control everything, except the things he dare not touch. The deep inequality of the tax burden. Colbert's reforms were precise, deliberate, and widely applauded by the king. He streamlined collections, cracked down on embezzlement, and improved reporting systems. But he never reformed the tax exemptions enjoyed by France's most powerful estates. France's tax system under Colbert remained deeply regressive. The first estate clergy paid almost no direct taxes, contributing gifts to the crown voluntarily. The second estate nobility enjoyed vast exemptions, paying very little tax on land or income. The third estate, the commoners, who represented over 95% of the population, bore the brunt of direct taxes like the taille, gabelle salt tax, and aids consumption taxes. Colbert did nothing to challenge this structure. Why? Because absolutism depended on the nobility's submission, not their rebellion. If Louis XIV's reign rested on delicate performances of power, Colbert's financial system rested on delicate concessions to privilege. The trouble with the taille. One of the most important taxes under Colbert's administration was the taille, a direct land tax levied on the non-noble population. It was meant to provide the bulk of the crown's revenue. Colbert tried to make the taille more efficient, ordering surveys, reducing fraud, and imposing tighter standards on collection. But it remained deeply unjust. Nobles whose lands produced vast profits often paid nothing, while peasants farming marginal plots were squeezed for every last liver. Worse, regional variations meant that two villages might pay wildly different rates, depending on whether they were classified as pays d'elections, directly administered, or pays d'états, with their own fiscal assemblies. Colbert centralized much of this, reducing the worst abuses, but the structural unfairness remained. He could calibrate the system, but he would not challenge its fundamentals. Life for the taxpayer. In the countryside, Colbert's efficiency did not always feel like a blessing. Peasants often found themselves visited more frequently by tax collectors, expected to pay in coin even when harvests were poor. As the crown increased its demand for cash, rural economies still largely barter-based struggled. In towns, the new indirect taxes on goods and consumption also hit hardest on those with the least. The tax on salt, the gabelle, in particular, became a symbol of royal overreach. Peasants were forced to buy salt at fixed prices from royal depots, even if they had no real need for it. Smuggling and punishment for smuggling became widespread. To the people, the king's glittering palace and fountains at Versailles stood in stark contrast to the rising weight of state demands. Colbert and the guilds. In his drive to modernize the economy, Colbert placed great emphasis on guilds, tightly regulated associations of artisans and tradesmen in France's cities. He restructured and revived many of them, believing that they ensured quality control. They provided training through apprenticeships. They allowed the state to monitor production and collect dues more easily. Colbert issued new charters, regulated product standards, and even established royal inspectors to ensure compliance. He wanted every piece of cloth, every barrel of wine, every spoon and candle to meet a national standard. It was, in theory, a way to boost exports and strengthen internal trade. But in practice, guilds also became barriers to innovation. Entry was restricted, products were limited to fixed specifications. Creativity was stifled in favor of order. Still, for Colbert, uniformity meant control, and control was always preferable to unpredictability. Infrastructure as statecraft. Colbert is remembered not just for taxes, but for building things. He championed the construction of canals, such as the Canal du Midi, linking the Mediterranean to the Atlantic. Roads, improving communication across the vast kingdom. Ports, especially in La Rochelle, Marseille, and Brest, to support both trade and naval power. Warehouses, grain depots, and markets to reduce dependence on local harvests. These projects weren't just practical, they were ideological. They symbolized the reach of the king and the penetration of central authority into every corner of the realm. Where a new road appeared, so did a royal inspector. Where a port grew, so did tax collectors and royal tariffs. Infrastructure became a tool of visibility and of surveillance. Colbert the educator. Another lesser-known side of Colbert's rule was his interest in education and information. He established the Académie des Sciences, supporting scientific inquiry aligned with state interests. Strengthened the Académie Française, enforcing linguistic standards that promoted French as a national and diplomatic language. Supported census efforts, agricultural surveys, and scientific expeditions. To Colbert, a well-informed state was a strong state. Knowledge was not neutral, it was a resource to be harvested for the service of the crown. Maps, measurements, reports, tables. It wasn't just data, it was power. But time was running out. Despite his extraordinary talents, Colbert could not fix everything. By the 1670s, his relationship with Louis XIV had begun to strain. The king's interest had shifted to endless wars, which consumed resources faster than Colbert could collect them. Lavish court expenditures, which undermined Colbert's efforts at frugality. The clergy and nobility, who continued to press for exemptions and privileges. Colbert found himself increasingly sidelined by other ministers, such as Louvois, who oversaw the military. He watched, frustrated, as the king reversed some of his reforms and expanded expenditures beyond sustainable limits. In 1683, Colbert died overworked, exhausted, and disappointed. He left behind a more organized state, but one still burdened by inequality and increasingly strained by imperial ambition. And so we end this section. With the sound of a pen falling silent, the ledgers closed, the reforms filed away. The man who brought order to a chaotic kingdom who tried to turn monarchy into machine is gone. But his legacy remains, hidden in plain sight. The roads he built still connect the provinces. The records he compiled still shape the bureaucracy. The systems he designed still collect the coin that funds the court. And yet the contradiction endures. Can a system built on inequality ever truly be made efficient? And when does order, so carefully constructed, begin to crack under the weight of what it refuses to change? The numbers were balanced on paper, the coffers refilled for a time. The king, ever radiant in his gold-trimmed halls, presided over what seemed to be a thriving state. But Jean-Baptiste Colbert is dead. And in his absence, the machine begins to sputter, slowly, quietly at first. Colbert had built a system of astonishing complexity and reach. He turned the sprawling French kingdom into something that could be mapped, measured, taxed, and counted. But he also left behind a structure rigid, exclusionary, and deeply unequal. In this final section, we reflect on what happened after Colbert's pen fell silent. We examine the cracks that spread through his carefully laid foundation, and we ask what it means to build a state so efficient that it forgets whom it is meant to serve. After Colbert, the unraveling begins. After Colbert's death in 1683, King Louis XIV appointed Claude Lepelletier as Controller General of Finances. Though competent, Lepelletier lacked Colbert's vision and, more importantly, his political will. The old minister had tried to restrain royal spending, especially during wartime, but Louis was now fully consumed by grandeur and conflict. The War of the League of Augsburg, 1680–1697, and the War of the Spanish Succession, 1701–1714, devoured the treasury. By the end of Louis's reign, France was deeply in debt. Tax revenues were increasingly mortgaged to lenders. The burden on the Third Estate had become intolerable. Colbert's fiscal machine had worked, but only as long as the state did not overspend. When it did, the machine turned on the people. The rise of tax farming again. Colbert had tried to limit tax farming, the corrupt system in which private financiers collected taxes in exchange for a cut. It was inefficient and exploitative. But with growing military expenses and mounting debt, the state returned to this system in desperation. Financiers became more powerful. They paid the crown up front for the right to collect taxes, then squeezed the populace to recoup their investment, and then some. The result: more abuse, more evasion, more resentment. The very system Colbert had tried to clean up came roaring back, more desperate and more damaging than before. A state that could measure but not fix. One of Colbert's enduring legacies was administrative visibility. He had created records, astonishing volumes of them. Agricultural production, population estimates, land surveys, trade inventories. In theory, the monarchy now knew more about its people than ever before. But knowing was not the same as helping. The reports showed widespread poverty, famine in bad harvest years, uneven development between north and south, peasants fleeing land to avoid taxes, And yet the state did not adjust. It recorded suffering, then filed it away. Colbert had built a surveillance state of economic behavior, but the system lacked flexibility. Its goal had never been equity. It had been revenue. The Enlightenment flickers. As the 18th century dawned, a new intellectual current began to ripple through France. Philosophers like Montesquieu, Voltaire, and Rousseau would later question the very foundations of absolutism, and the idea that a monarchy could organize a just society without accountability. They would critique the privileges of the nobility and clergy, the weight of taxation on the poor, the control of trade and production by royal fiat, the lack of representation in state decision-making. Though these critiques lay in the future, they grew in the shadow of Colbert's system. His vision had brought order, but order without voice, without flexibility, without consent. And the educated elite lawyers, merchants, scholars began to notice the fragility of centralized success. Centralization is powerful, but it is also vulnerable. Under Colbert, all paths led to the king. For patronage, for appointments, for relief. But what happens when the king is no longer capable? When the finances are in shambles? When the bureaucracy, though efficient, becomes unresponsive? The fragility of the system became clear after Louis XIV's death in 1715. The regency of Philippe d'Orléans, governing for the child King Louis XV, tried to reform the economy, experiment with credit, even decentralize some tax authority. But the institutional habits of absolutism were hard to shake. Provincial elites had been weakened. Local institutions had decayed. Trust in government had eroded. The tools were there, but the hands to wield them wisely were gone. Globe showing Europe, Africa, Colbert's global legacy. Despite its flaws, Colbert's system worked for a time. It enabled France to build one of Europe's largest navies, dominate global trade routes, expand its colonial empire, establish cultural and linguistic influence across the continent. Even today, France's bureaucratic culture, its love of regulation, formality, and administrative centrality echoes Colbert. His legacy lives on in the French Civil Service, the National Institute of Statistics and Economic Studies, INSCE, the Académie Française. He helped define what a modern state could be: efficient, organized, data-driven. But he also left a warning: a system without equity becomes brittle. Candle final reflection: the kingdom that knew itself. Jean-Baptiste Colbert built a kingdom that could see itself in numbers, roads, ships, factories, and farms. He imposed rhythm on chaos, discipline on disorder. But visibility is not the same as justice. His system counted the poor but did not lift them, recorded suffering but did not share its burden, organized the kingdom but left power unshared. It worked until it didn't, until war, debt, and exclusion began to corrode the polished surface. In the end, Colbert's true legacy is a paradox. He made the state strong enough to survive, but rigid enough to break. And so we close his ledger asking, can a system that excludes so many ever truly be stable? And what happens when the bookkeepers are gone and the books no longer balance? Story 4. Louvois and the Sword reforming the French army. As the fountains of Versailles danced and the king's shadow fell across polished marble, far from the mirrored halls, soldiers marched in step. Muskets glinted in the sunlight. Drums beat like hearts of empire. Fortresses rose on muddy hillsides and supply carts groaned under the weight of war. If Colbert had built the body of the French state, it was Louvois who armed it. This is the story of a man who saw warfare not as glory or spectacle, but as administration, infrastructure, and discipline. It is the story of how France, under Louis XIV, created the largest standing army in Europe not through battlefield genius, but through paperwork, and of how that army would become both the pride of the state and a burden it could barely carry. Who was Louvois? François Michel Letellier, born in 1641, was the son of Michel Letellier, a key royal minister under both Mazarin and Louis XIV. He grew up in government not as a soldier but as a scribe. He learned not just tactics but logistics, not glory but governance. Appointed Secretary of State for War in 1662, at just 21 years old, Louvois was quickly thrust into one of the most complex roles in government: maintaining, expanding, and modernizing the army. Louis XIV wanted to dominate Europe, but wars are not won with parades. They are won with supply lines, discipline, and control. Louvois understood this, and so he began not with the sword but with the ledger. The army before Louvois. Before Louvois, the French military was a chaotic mix of independent regiments raised by nobles, irregular payments to soldiers, poor sanitation, food, and equipment, rampant desertion, mutiny, and abuse. Officers purchased their commands. Loyalty was local, not national. Troops lived by pillage as much as by salary. Discipline was inconsistent, and corruption, particularly in provisioning, was routine. It was a feudal army in an absolutist age. If the Sun King was to shine across Europe, his soldiers needed more than courage. They needed a system. Louvois delivered one built on paperwork, prisons, and precise expectations. Clipboard Louvois' reforms, turning chaos into core. 1. Regular pay and supply. Louvois created a central administration to manage soldier pay, rations, and equipment. He cracked down on embezzlement and made payment more reliable, at least in peacetime. Soldiers who had once starved or looted now had some assurance of wages. 2. Military hospitals. He established hospitals for wounded and sick soldiers, notably the Hôtel des Invalides in Paris, still standing today. This marked a shift. The army began to care for its own, reducing desertion and improving morale. 3. Discipline and training. He introduced standardized training drills, stricter discipline, and regular inspections. Desertion was punished harshly, but for those who obeyed, life in the army became more predictable. 4. Officer accountability. Louvois reviewed appointments personally. Officers who abused power or neglected duty were reprimanded or dismissed. Nobles could still buy commissions, but they were now monitored. 5. Infrastructure. He expanded the military postal system, established depots for arms and food, and organized roads for troop movement. Louvois, in essence, turned war into a department. The fortress strategy, enter Vauban. One of Louvois' most lasting partnerships was with Sébastien Leprestre de Vauban, the king's chief military engineer. Vauban revolutionized fortification and siegecraft building, star-shaped citadels across France's borders. But these fortresses were not simply defenses. They were expressions of sovereignty, physical lines on the land saying, "This is France." Louvois directed resources to support Vauban's efforts, building supply roads, coordinating garrisons, establishing artillery depots. Together, they built the Pré Carré, a green lawn, of connected fortresses forming a double line along the northeastern frontier. It was militarized landscaping, and it worked. France became harder to invade and easier to defend. Compass the army as a tool of centralization. Louvois' reforms did more than make war efficient. They pulled power into the center. Under his system, regiments were no longer tools of noble families. Promotions depended on merit and royal favor, not just blood. The king, through Louvois, held the keys to command. Even recruitment was centralized. The system of militia conscription was expanded. Peasants, townsmen, and even criminals were drawn into service, their names recorded, their fates managed. In this way, the army became a mirror of the state, hierarchical, bureaucratic, and tightly watched. Absolutism had found its boots. Whole, but at what cost? Building a modern army is expensive, even under a master of logistics. Louvois' reforms meant salaries for tens of thousands of men, medical care, pensions, and burials, supply chains stretching across Europe, constant fortification building. During peacetime, this system was sustainable, but Louis XIV did not believe in peacetime. As the king launched war after war, the Dutch War, 1602-1678, the War of the Reunions, 1683-1684, and later, the War of the League of Augsburg, the army ballooned. At its peak, France maintained over 400,000 troops, the largest standing army in Europe. Even Louvois at times urged restraint. But glory demanded sacrifice. And numbers, even precise ones, could not always hold back ambition. And so we end this section. With a kingdom dressed for battle, its cannons are cleaned, its boots are shined, its orders are inked in ledgers not shouted from horses. Louvois has done what few ministers ever achieve. He has imposed discipline on chaos. He has made soldiers tools of state, not of noble pride. He has given France a military system it would use and rely on for generations. But as the weight of war presses down, a question echoes across the mustering fields. Can any system, no matter how precise, withstand a king who craves conquest? It begins with the beat of a drum. In the early morning mist, regiments assemble. Officers shout orders. Gunpowder is weighed. Swords gleam. Somewhere, distant bells toll as a town readies for siege. Supply wagons creak into place, escorted by cavalry. In this well-orchestrated motion, there is no chaos, only order. Louvois' army is ready. This section leads us into the wars that defined Louis XIV's reign, wars that tested the reforms of Louvois, strained the state Colbert helped build, and stretched France's military might to its limits. The soldier is now part of the bureaucracy. The battlefield, a ledger line, but war has its own rhythm, and the sword, no matter how carefully forged, cuts both ways. Fire the Dutch War, 1672-1678, a lesson in overreach. The first real test of Louvois' reformed army came in the Dutch War, launched in 1672. Louis XIV sought to expand France's borders, punish the Dutch Republic for diplomatic slights, and affirm his dominance over European politics. The war began with shocking speed. French troops, now drilled, uniformed, and supplied, overran parts of the Dutch Republic in weeks. The new infrastructure Louvois had built functioned brilliantly. Bridges, supply lines, and military depots ensured that French forces could move with unusual efficiency. The fortress network held against counterattacks. But then came the flood. The Dutch opened their dikes, flooding the lowlands and halting the French advance. The terrain became impassable. The campaign stalled. A quick war turned into a long slog. Meanwhile, other powers, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, Brandenburg, joined the Dutch against France. Suddenly, France was surrounded. Louvois' logistical genius kept the army intact. Troops were reinforced, fed, rotated. But the war dragged on. The costs mounted. Civilians in occupied regions suffered under military requisition and taxation. The lesson was clear. A modern army could win battles, but coalitions of nations, geography, and political resistance could still check the king's ambition. The reunions and the rise of Vauban. In the 1680s, France entered a brief period of expansion through legal maneuvering known as the War of the Reunions. Rather than outright conquest, France now used technicalities, claiming territories that once belonged to lands it had already annexed. It was a lawyer's war, but it still needed soldiers. Louvois supported these moves with intimidating shows of military force, built around the ever-growing network of Vauban fortresses. Vauban's designs, angular, mathematical, star-shaped, were nearly impossible to conquer. Towns like Strasbourg, Luxembourg, and Cazel became jewels in France's fortified crown. But even as the army improved, the underlying burden grew. Troop numbers ballooned. Food costs skyrocketed. Training and supply became harder to maintain as units multiplied. Louvois' machine was scaling, but so were its demands. Chains repression in the name of order, the dragonnades. In the 1680s, Louvois also oversaw the military aspect of a deeply controversial royal policy, the persecution of Protestants. After Louis XIV revoked the Edict of Nantes in 1685, Protestant churches were shut down, schools closed, and clergy exiled. But it was Louvois who implemented the dragonnades, a strategy of billeting troops in Huguenot homes to harass them into converting. The idea was simple and cruel. Assign unruly soldiers to Protestant households. Encourage harassment and humiliation. Make life unbearable until conversion or flight seemed the only option. The policy worked in a brutal sense. Hundreds of thousands of Huguenots converted or fled France. But the army's image, carefully cultivated by Louvois, suffered. No longer just a national protector, the army became an instrument of domestic repression. And France lost tens of thousands of skilled citizens. Artisans, merchants, thinkers, people who had once paid taxes, served the economy and supported the social fabric. A victory of ideology. A loss of capacity. Crossed the War of the League of Augsburg, 1688–1697. War at scale. By the late 1680s, the rest of Europe had grown alarmed by Louis's expansion and aggression. The Dutch, English, Austrians, and various German states formed the League of Augsburg, later called the Grand Alliance. France was now at war on multiple fronts. Louvois' army, now numbering over 300,000, was the largest in Europe. It was professionally trained, uniformed and armed, capable of coordinated movement across multiple theaters. But it was also expensive, stretched thin, and increasingly reliant on harsh requisition, seizing supplies from towns and peasants to support ongoing campaigns. Louvois, who had once prided himself on order and control, now oversaw an army that was devouring the countryside. In the Rhineland, French troops conducted scorched earth campaigns, burning entire towns to deny them to the enemy. Cities like Heidelberg and Mannheim were razed. Civilians fled in waves. These were not strategic miscalculations. They were deliberate, ordered by Louvois, approved by the king. The war became one of attrition. France won battles but lost goodwill. The system held, but barely. Chart decreasing Louvois' decline and death. By the early 1690s, Louvois was exhausted. He had run France's war machine for nearly 3 decades. He had transformed the army and bent it to the king's will. But tensions with Louis XIV had begun to emerge. The king grew impatient with delays and failures. Louvois clashed with Vauban, who advocated for less destruction and more humane policies. Other ministers like Torcy and Chamlay began to gain influence. In 1691, Louvois died suddenly of a stroke. His death marked the end of an era. The army would continue to grow, but the system he had built was now on autopilot, less governed by vision, more by habit. And the cost? Mounting, hidden in shadows, borne by those far from Versailles. And so we end this section. With a nation in uniform, a system that worked, a machine that functioned until it didn't. Louvois had given the king what he wanted: control, reach, and might. He professionalized warfare. He gave France teeth. But in doing so, he tied the fate of the state to the unrelenting needs of war. And as France stood triumphant, battered and burdened, a question lingered in every burning village. Can a state survive when its greatest achievement is the efficiency with which it makes war? A fortress still stands, its bastions sharp as stars. A cannon lies silent, its barrel rusting in the rain. And in a dusty archive bound in leather and faded ink sit lists of names, thousands of them soldiers, officers, prisoners, deserters. The machine Louvois built was not merely made of men and steel. It was built of discipline, paperwork, and policy. It had sustained the monarchy through decades of war, reshaped the map of Europe, and projected the grandeur of Louis XIV across a continent. But what becomes of a military system when the enemy is no longer across a border, but within the very society that built it? This final section explores the long shadow of Louvois' reforms, the human cost, the growing tension between efficiency and excess, and how a state that perfected the art of war slowly began to unravel under the very weight of its martial success. An army without rest. Under Louvois, France maintained one of the first permanent, professional standing armies in modern European history. This was no longer an army raised for a season or for a single campaign. It was a fixture part of the state's daily operations. At its height, over 400,000 men served in uniform. Garrisons were maintained year-round. Recruitment drives became regular state affairs. Fortresses became permanent installation across the borders of France. This professionalization brought stability but also strain. Peacetime no longer meant peace. It meant preparation for the next war, and each war required more. More money, more conscripts, more food, more uniforms, more suffering. Man farmer the toll on rural France. The army may have been centralized, but its recruits came from every village and hamlet in France. Under Louvois, a lottery-based conscription system, the milice, was expanded. Young men were chosen by draw to serve. The selection was often resented, especially by peasants whose families depended on their labor. Though exemptions could be purchased, this too reflected the familiar injustice. The rich could avoid service. The poor had no choice. In regions already taxed heavily, losing a son to military service could mean economic ruin. And once in uniform, survival was uncertain. Disease was rampant. Pay was inconsistent. Pensions were rare. The reforms had created a modern army, but it was often sustained by involuntary sacrifice. Firecracker, the banality of violence. War, as executed under Louvois, became administrative. Requisitions were standardized. Siege warfare was calculated with geometry. Troop movements were scheduled like grain deliveries. But war never became clean. Under Louvois' policies, especially during campaigns in the Palatinate, civilian populations were intentionally targeted. Towns were burned. Fields were salted. Refugees filled roadsides. These scorched earth tactics aimed to deny the enemy shelter, but they also erased communities. What had once been irregular cruelty became official strategy. This normalization of destruction raised few alarms in court. The system functioned, the ledgers balanced. But the people remembered. Detective the army and the expansion of surveillance. Louvois didn't just create a war machine. He extended the logic of military control into everyday life. Muster rolls, desertion reports, and court-martial proceedings filled state archives. Army censors monitored correspondence. Royal inspectors audited officers and garrison commanders. In effect, the army became a template for how the absolutist state governed, with layers of oversight, centralized documentation, and consequences for deviation. This creeping militarization of society blurred the lines between civilian and soldier. Control became the defining characteristic of governance, not just on the battlefield, but in the town square. Balance the moral weight, Vauban's rebellion. One of the most fascinating conflicts of the later war years wasn't fought with weapons but with words. Sébastien Leprestre de Vauban, Louvois' great collaborator and France's chief military engineer, began to speak out. A loyal servant of the crown, Vauban had built dozens of fortresses, engineered countless sieges, served in every major campaign. But by the 1690s, he had grown disillusioned. He argued that the army was overgrown. The tax burden on the poor was unjust. The policies of forced conversion and repression were morally and politically disastrous. In 1707, he circulated a private manuscript, La Dime Royale, in which he proposed a universal, proportional tax on all classes, including the nobility and clergy. It was never published in his lifetime, but it was a radical gesture, challenging the very foundation of absolutism's fiscal and military order. And it marked the beginning of resistance from within. Stop sign, the system begins to stall. After Louvois' death, his successors, most notably Barbezieux, his own son, struggled to maintain the same level of control. The army remained strong, but cracks appeared. Corruption returned. Logistics faltered during harsh winters. Recruitment became more desperate. Desertion rose. By the final years of Louis XIV's reign, France was exhausted. The War of the Spanish Succession had drained every reserve, financial, human, and emotional. Even the king, once the embodiment of warlike glory, grew weary. His last battles were marked more by attrition than triumph. The system held, but only just. And beneath the polished cuirasses and the measured marches, the foundations of absolutism were starting to rot. Scroll the legacy of Louvois. Louvois had reshaped France's army, and in doing so, reshaped France itself. He had turned feudal levies into a national fighting force, standardized supply, pay, discipline, and movement, linked military service to state identity, extended the reach of the monarchy into every commune. His work endured long after his death. Even during the French Revolution, the institutional memory of Louvois' system remained repurposed for new ideals. But his greatest legacy may not have been tactical or administrative. It was psychological. He proved that the state could organize human life into systems of control, and that war could be managed like business. It was a lesson eagerly learned by modern states in the centuries to follow. Candle final reflection. A sword hung in silence. Now the boots are stored, the drums have quieted, the uniforms are folded away in museums. The fortresses still cast long shadows on the countryside, reminders of an age where every field could become a frontier. Louvois' name is little remembered today, overshadowed by kings and generals. But his fingerprints remain not just in the ruins of fortresses, but in the very idea that a nation could live in uniform. He gave France an army that worked, that fought, that won. But as the cost grew in lives, in freedom, in future, we must ask, is a state stronger when it holds the sword, or when it dares to lay it down? Story 5. The edict revoked Huguenots and the price of religious unity. Imagine a Sunday morning in a quiet French village in 1660. The church bell rings, but not everyone attends. Down a side path behind closed shutters, a group gathers in silence. Their Bibles are worn. Their songs are whispered. They do not kneel before statues. They do not pray to saints. They are Huguenots, French Protestants in a kingdom built for Catholic kings. They are protected for now by a law older than Louis XIV himself. But the law is fragile, and the man who wears the crown does not believe in compromise. This is the story of a forgotten civil war that never quite ended. A story not of grand battles, but of laws, letters, and silent departures. It begins with a document meant to preserve peace and ends with an exodus. The Edict of Nantes, 1598, a royal compromise. To understand what Louis XIV destroyed, we must first understand what his grandfather built. The Edict of Nantes, issued in 1598 by King Henry IV, brought an end to decades of religious civil war in France. At the heart of that conflict, Protestants, Huguenots, and Catholics' neighbors turned enemies. The edict was revolutionary for its time. It allowed Huguenots to worship publicly in designated areas, granted them the right to hold public office, permitted them to build schools and maintain fortified towns for self-defense, promised them equal treatment under the law, at least in theory. It was not full religious freedom, but it was a fragile peace. And it held for over 80 years. Open book. Who were the Huguenots? The Huguenots were Calvinists, followers of the teachings of John Calvin, who emphasized predestination, simplicity in worship, personal interpretation of Scripture, a rejection of Catholic hierarchy. They were often urban, literate, industrious. Many were artisans, merchants, and skilled tradesmen, concentrated in regions like Languedoc, Poitou, Dauphiné, and parts of Normandy. They built schools, ran workshops, and fostered networks of trade and education. In many places, they contributed to local economies at a scale far beyond their numbers. By the mid-17th century, an estimated 800,000 to 1 million Huguenots lived in France, about 5% of the population. They were tolerated, but never trusted. Dove Louis XIV and Richelieu, toleration under surveillance. After Henry IV's assassination in 1610, his son Louis XIV took the throne, with Cardinal Richelieu as chief minister. Richelieu distrusted the Huguenots. To him, their fortified towns and semi-autonomous status posed a threat to royal authority. So, during the siege of La Rochelle, 1627-1628, he crushed one of the strongest Huguenot strongholds. The military power of the Protestants was broken. But, and this is crucial, the Edict of Nantes remained. Worship was still legal, rights still guaranteed. It was not love, it was not harmony. It was cold toleration. And it would survive for another generation, until Louis XIV decided it had survived long enough. Crown Louis XIV's religious vision. Louis XIV was raised in the wake of the Fronde. He saw religious division as a threat to unity, not just spiritually, but politically. To him, one king, one law, and one faith were essential to national strength. Though initially cautious, Louis gradually began to undermine the Edict of Nantes. Huguenot temples were closed or destroyed. Worship was restricted to fewer locations. Huguenots were banned from government, military, and professional roles. Children could be taken from Protestant families and raised Catholic. This campaign wasn't sudden. It was slow, deliberate, and legalistic, designed to erode toleration without formally revoking it. Louis believed, or claimed to believe, that most Protestants would convert if pressure increased just slightly more. In this belief, he was tragically mistaken. Fire the conversion strategy. Beginning in the early 1680s, Louis shifted tactics. If tolerance had failed, coercion would succeed. His government introduced policies that made life unbearable for Huguenots. Protestant worship was surveilled. Protestant marriages were delegitimized. The dragonnades began billeting unruly soldiers in Huguenot homes to harass them into conversion. Imagine it. A household with 3 children. A dozen rowdy dragoons move in. They destroy furniture, drink wine, mock prayers. They say, convert and we'll leave. Thousands did convert in appearance, on paper. But many others fled, or went underground, or resisted quietly. And still Louis pushed further. Firecracker the edict revoked 1685, the final blow. On October 18, 1685, Louis XIV signed the Edict of Fontainebleau, which revoked the Edict of Nantes. The new edict outlawed Protestantism entirely, banned Huguenot worship, ordered all Protestant ministers to leave the country, forbade laypeople from emigrating under penalty of death or galley slavery, mandated the baptism and Catholic education of all Protestant children. It was, effectively, an attempt to erase Huguenot identity from France. Louis presented it as a success. There are no more Protestants in my kingdom. He believed he had achieved religious unity. But he had achieved something else entirely, a national wound that would never fully heal. And so we end this section. With silence in a village church, the pews are empty, the doors are sealed, the Bibles hidden under floorboards. A family disappears in the night, bound for the coast, praying the soldiers do not hear the creak of the cart. The edict meant to end war has been revoked, but peace does not follow. Instead, we are left to ask, what happens when a king confuses unity with conformity? And when faith becomes a crime, how far must one go to remain free? It began with whispers. A family vanishes from a town in Poitou. A workshop closes without notice in Lyon. A weaver's loom sits silent in Nimes. No farewell, no letters, only the emptiness left behind. This was not a flight of armies, nor the thunder of rebellion. It was a quiet exodus, a tide of departure, made illegal by the king, yet unstoppable in its determination. The revocation of the Edict of Nantes did not eliminate Protestantism in France. It exported it. We follow the fates of those who left. The Huguenot diaspora, their perilous journeys, the world they found abroad, and the hole they left behind at home. Emigration becomes a crime. After the Edict of Fontainebleau in 1685, Protestant worship was outlawed. Ministers were ordered to leave France, but for laypeople, ordinary believers, emigration was forbidden. To flee was to break the law, penalties included confiscation of property, imprisonment or death, galley slavery for men caught at sea. For women, confinement in Catholic convents, often for life. But the law did not deter them. Between 1685 and 1715, an estimated 180,000 to 250,000 Huguenots escaped France. They crossed mountains, hid in cargo holds, bribed guards, and disguised themselves. They took nothing but their names, trades, and a refusal to bend. Thread the journeys, flight through shadow. Paths out of France were treacherous, many fled. North into the Dutch Republic or German principalities. West to England and Ireland. East through the Swiss Alps. South into Savoy, then onward to Geneva or Italy. Some crossed on foot, others sailed hidden in barrels. Families were separated, some were captured and never heard from again. Entire Protestant communities vanished overnight, their churches destroyed, cemeteries desecrated, records burned. But the refugees carried more than pain. They carried knowledge of silk weaving from lionized towns, skills in clockmaking and metalwork, traditions of education, literacy, and independent thought. Wherever they went, they built again. Classical hosts of the exiles, reception across Europe. Though banished at home, the Huguenots were welcomed abroad, sometimes eagerly. In the Dutch Republic, entire towns were established for Huguenot exiles. Protestant ministers resumed preaching. French-language schools and presses flourished. In England, the English crown offered asylum, especially after the Glorious Revolution, 1688. Huguenot communities in London, Canterbury, and Norwich grew rapidly. Many joined the textile and merchant trades, enriching the economy. In Brandenburg, Prussia, the Elector Frederick William issued the Edict of Potsdam, 1685, inviting Huguenots to settle. Tens of thousands moved to Berlin and surrounding areas. They revitalized war-damaged regions with their skills. In Switzerland, Ireland, South Africa, even North America, Huguenot names began to appear, often French-sounding, but bearing new flags. They were strangers but also assets. House life in exile. Huguenot exiles were not simply passive victims. They formed churches in their own language, schools to preserve their traditions, printing presses to spread Protestant texts and anti-Louis pamphlets. Many felt a deep loyalty to France, even in exile. They did not think of themselves as foreigners but as true French people, denied their homeland by tyranny. Some joined foreign armies against Louis XIV, hoping to one day return and restore religious freedom. Others contributed quietly, weaving fabric in London, distilling spirits in Berlin, teaching French in Amsterdam. They became citizens of nowhere, and yet, strangely, ambassadors of a France that no longer existed, a France of conscience, law, and divided belief. Chart decreasing economic consequences for France. The departure of the Huguenots was not just a spiritual loss, it was a material wound. By 1700, many towns had lost tradespeople in textiles, metallurgy, and finance, seen commercial networks dissolve overnight, experienced a decline in innovation, particularly in small manufacturing. In cities like Lyon, the silk trade slowed. Nîmes, textile workshops shuttered. La Rochelle, shipbuilding withered. Colbert's earlier efforts to build a mercantile France had depended on the very people now in exile, and Louvois' system of army provisioning, often managed by men from Huguenot communities. While Louis XIV celebrated religious unity, he had dismantled part of the economic engine that powered his state. Book's cultural loss in silence. The Protestant contribution to French culture was often invisible but real. High literacy rates, emphasis on moral self-discipline, commitment to civic responsibility and record-keeping, a belief in education, especially for girls. By removing these communities, Louis did more than close churches, he narrowed the intellectual diversity of his realm. And perhaps most tragically, he silenced voices. No more Protestant poets, scholars, or theologians. No more dissent. Only whispers and eventually nothing at all. Candle, and so we end this section. With ships rocking in foreign harbors, with new churches rising in cities that had never heard Calvin's name, with old family names etched on tombstones thousands of miles from the land of their birth. Louis XIV had achieved unity, but only through subtraction. A kingdom smaller, quieter, and in some ways poorer. And across Europe, a question took root in every exiled Huguenot's heart. If a king can take your home, your property, your rights, what remains of your identity and what makes you truly free? France had made its decision. The temples were torn down. The pastors were gone. The people scattered like leaves on a restless wind. And for a time, it seemed that Louis XIV had succeeded, that Protestantism in France was no more than a memory, locked away behind stone altars and barred windows. But memories persist. They linger in abandoned villages, in closed Bibles hidden beneath floorboards, in the quiet refusal of belief to bend to power. This final section explores what happened after the revocation, the resistance that remained, the underground churches, the foreign wars, the legacy both immediate and long-term of France's experiment in forced religious unity. The church in the wilderness, the desert. After the revocation, Protestantism did not vanish. It simply went underground. From 1685 onwards, clandestine worship continued in forests, caves, and remote valleys, especially in the rugged region of the Cévennes. This secret Protestant movement came to be known as the Desert, a biblical reference to the Israelites wandering in exile. Worship took place under moonlight in hidden glens, led by itinerant preachers, often in disguise, with watchers posted along the roads to warn of soldiers. The risks were enormous. If caught, ministers faced execution. Worshippers could be imprisoned, beaten, or forced into convents or galleys. Yet the assemblies continued. Hymns were sung in whispers, children baptized in secret. The faith survived not through confrontation but through resilient quiet. Dagger the Camisard Revolt, 1702-1704. The silence did not last forever. In 1702, the tensions in the Cévennes exploded into open revolt. The Camisards, mostly poor Protestant peasants and shepherds, took up arms against the royal troops. They were named for the coarse white shirts, chemises, they wore. Key features of the revolt. Leaders claimed divine visions and inspiration. Guerrilla tactics were used against French regulars. Catholic churches and clergy were attacked. Royal forces responded with brutal repression. Entire villages were burned. Civilians were slaughtered or forcibly relocated. The Cévennes became a battlefield not for land but for faith. By 1704, the rebellion was crushed. Thousands were dead. The survivors were scattered. Yet even in defeat, the Camisards became symbols of Protestant defiance, a rare moment when the persecuted spoke not in whispers, but in fire. France, the exiles fight back. Protestants in foreign armies. While their brothers and sisters worshipped in secrecy, many exiled Huguenots took up arms abroad. Across Europe they served in the Dutch army under William III, the British forces, including in the War of Spanish Succession, the Prussian military as officers and trainers. These soldiers weren't just fighting for pay, they were fighting for revenge, and for the chance to one day return to a free France. A few served in elite units, such as the English-French regiments, composed entirely of Huguenots, the Swiss and German mercenary groups that became the backbone of many European armies. Their military contributions were not minor. They brought with them the discipline and resilience of a people who had survived persecution, and in doing so, helped shape the armies of modern Europe. DNA cultural legacy of the diaspora. The Huguenots who fled France planted deep roots in their host countries. In London, their influence is still visible. Spitalfields became a hub for silk weaving. French churches thrived for generations. Huguenot surnames became anglicized, Dubois to wood, Chevalier to knight. In Berlin, they helped modernize agriculture and crafts. In Geneva, they strengthened the city's identity as a Protestant intellectual center. In South Africa, they became part of the settler fabric, introducing viticulture and French techniques. In North America, Huguenots settled in Charleston, New York, and Boston, contributing to colonial governance and industry. They were not just survivors, they were builders. Each new community became a kind of living archive of the France they had lost and the one they had hoped for. Chart decreasing France without the Huguenots. Back in France, the absence was deafening. Skilled trades declined. International merchant networks fractured. Innovation slowed in regions once rich with Protestant industry. Even Catholic voices later began to question the wisdom of the revocation. By the 18th century, some members of the Enlightenment, including Voltaire, would look back at Louis XIV's policy not as a triumph, but a moral and economic mistake. In 1787, just 2 years before the Revolution, Louis XVI issued the Edict of Tolerance, officially restoring civil rights to Protestants. But it was too late. The world had moved on, and the kingdom that once drove out its own had begun to collapse under the weight of its contradictions. Scroll A returned, but not a restoration. Some Huguenot families returned to France after 1787. Others came back only after the Napoleonic era. But Protestantism in France was never again what it had been. The once vibrant network of Reformed churches was now fragmented, rural, quiet. The Protestant memory lived more fully abroad, where it continued to influence law, education, and religious thought in more tolerant environments. France had sacrificed a minority and gained only a century of silence in return. Candle final reflection, a faith carried far. In the end, the revocation of the Edict of Nantes achieved something very different from what Louis XIV had intended. He had hoped to unify France. Instead, he scattered part of it across the globe. He hoped to make one faith dominant. Instead, he strengthened religious pluralism abroad. He tried to erase a people. Instead, he created a diaspora, one that would shape Europe, the Americas, and beyond. And so we leave this story not in Versailles, or in Paris, or even in Nimes, but in a churchyard in London, or a vineyard in Cape Town, or a stone house in Geneva, where the psalms are sung in accented French, and the memory of a lost homeland still lingers. And we ask, can a nation truly control belief? Or does faith, once planted, find new soil wherever it is carried, no matter how far it must flee? Story 6. Versailles and the Machinery of Royal Splendor. A hallway stretches into the distance, lit by the warm glow of morning sun reflecting off endless mirrors. Beyond it, the rustle of silk, the tap of heels, the soft echo of a fountain in a perfectly measured garden. A nobleman bows. A page scurries past. Somewhere, a king stirs. This is Versailles, not just a palace, but a machine. A place where ritual replaced politics, and where the very architecture of power reshaped an entire kingdom. In this story, we explore not only how Versailles was built, but how it functioned, as a tool of surveillance, spectacle, and soft domination. A place as boring as it was magnificent, and as quietly suffocating as it was publicly grand. It did not conquer with weapons. It conquered with velvet ropes and dinner invitations. Humble beginnings, the king in the woods. Versailles was not born a palace. It began as a simple hunting lodge, constructed by Louis XIV in 1623 in the marshy woodlands west of Paris. The location was unremarkable, damp, remote, and far from the centers of power, but young Louis XIV remembered it fondly. It was a place of escape, where the future king had ridden horses, hunted stags, and evaded the confines of Paris. After the chaos of the Fronde, that memory took on deeper meaning. To Louis XIV, Versailles was not just about grandeur. It was about control, spatial, social, and symbolic. By relocating his court there, he could distance himself from the Parisian mobs, reimagine kingship on his terms, create a world in which he was always the center. The transformation began in earnest in 1661, after the death of Cardinal Mazarin. What followed was one of the most ambitious construction projects in European history. Building the Grand Machine. Versailles did not rise overnight. It grew in phases, each more elaborate, expensive, and symbolically loaded than the last. Key figures included Louis le Vau, the first royal architect, who expanded the lodge into a classical chateau. André Le Nôtre, the landscape architect who sculpted the famous gardens. Charles Le Brun, the interior designer who filled the palace with allegorical paintings of Louis as Apollo, the sun god. Between 1661 and 1682, thousands of workers toiled, digging canals, hauling marble, draining swamps, erecting scaffolding. No expense was spared. Even the smallest fixtures bore the royal insignia. By 1682, Versailles was ready to become the official seat of government. Louis moved his court and never again made Paris his primary residence. The move was not just about luxury. It was a strategic relocation of power. Life in the Hall of Mirrors. The centerpiece of Versailles was and remains the Galerie des Glaces, or Hall of Mirrors. Lined with 357 mirrors facing the garden's windows, it created an illusion of infinite space and reflection, a literal and figurative symbol of the king's presence. It was here that royal decrees were signed, ambassadors were received, the court assembled for ceremonial events. But daily life at Versailles was far more structured and far more mundane than its glittering reputation suggests. Nobles were drawn to court not for amusement, but for access. And access came not from wealth, but from proximity to ritual. Mantelpiece, the ritual of the king's day, a clockwork court. Every morning, the king woke at 7:30 a.m. to begin his lever the rising ceremony. Dozens of nobles participated in stages. First the premier valet, then the grand chamberlain, then princes and dukes. Each performed small tasks, handing a shirt, pouring water not out of necessity, but to mark status. Throughout the day, meals were eaten in public view. Walks were timed, routes predetermined. Audiences were granted not by request, but by schedule. In the evening, the couch of the king's going-to-bed ritual mirrored the morning. This endless cycle of public ritual served one purpose: to keep the nobility occupied. They competed for the most trivial honors, holding a candlestick, arranging a chair while Louis conducted state business, with ministers behind closed doors. Power at Versailles was a game of attention. The nobles trapped in gold. The lure of Versailles was irresistible. Nobles were required to spend significant time at court if they wanted royal favor, pensions, offices, marriages for their children. To live at court, they needed lavish clothing, servants, rooms which were small, overcrowded, and often uncomfortable. To maintain appearances, many nobles went into debt. And that, too, was part of the plan. A noble deeply invested in court life was a noble who didn't raise troops, didn't form alliances in the provinces, didn't challenge the king. Louis XIV transformed an aristocracy of landowners into a class of glorified courtiers, beautifully dressed, endlessly flattered, and politically neutered. Deciduous tree the gardens, order in nature. Even the gardens at Versailles carried a message. Designed by André Le Notre, they were symmetrical, geometric, enormous. Everything was trimmed, aligned, regulated. Fountains played on command, trees were planted in rows, gravel paths were straight, not winding. It was nature, conquered by man, or more precisely by the king. To walk the gardens was to walk through an idealized kingdom, where every branch bent to the royal will. It was Versailles in miniature, beautiful, controlled, and utterly unnatural. Chart decreasing the cost of splendor. Maintaining Versailles required over 10,000 servants, gardeners, cooks, and soldiers. A constant supply of food, fuel, and fabrics. An immense bureaucratic apparatus. Estimates suggest that Versailles absorbed up to 25% of France's total annual budget during its peak. Yet strangely, it produced no wealth, only pageantry. As the wars dragged on and taxes rose, resentment grew among peasants and merchants, who saw their earnings consumed by this distant, unreachable court. Versailles was magnificent, but it was also a drain. A golden cage for the nobility and for the nation. And so we end this section. With the king retreating to his private chambers, candlelight flickering off golden walls, while courtiers whisper and pages prepare the furniture for tomorrow's rituals. Outside the gates, the fields lie fallow, the roads cracked, the distant villages hushed by poverty. Versailles has become the beating heart of royal France, but we must ask, what happens when a kingdom becomes a stage? And what is left when the applause stops and the curtain finally falls? By 1700, Versailles was no longer just a palace. It was a process, a system, a way of life. It measured time in ceremonies. It dispensed power in glances. And it reshaped the French state not with proclamations or punishment, but with routine, expectation, and the slow erosion of alternatives. We examined the mechanisms of that control, how nobles became ornaments, how ministers became managers, and how Louis XIV transformed governance into theater, where the roles were rigid and the audience never left. To live at Versailles was to become part of the script. The illusion of access. To the untrained eye, Versailles was a wonderland of freedom for the nobility. They dressed, danced, hunted, and dined with the king. But in truth, they were rarely alone. There was no privacy, most rooms were shared, gossip flourished. Nearly all interactions were ritualized. You did not speak unless spoken to. Movements were tracked by appointments, orders, and court calendars. Nobles felt honored just to stand in the king's presence. A mere nod could alter a family's fortunes. Yet in this economy of favors, Louis rarely gave anything concrete. His genius was in offering hope the possibility of advancement without ever surrendering actual power. He became the sole source of legitimacy. And everyone played along. Scroll a court without politics. You might think Versailles was a place of constant political discussion, but it was not. That was the point. Real decision-making occurred in councils, often behind closed doors. The Conseil den Haut, High Council, attended only by Louis and a few trusted ministers. The Conseil des Déparches, handling provincial reports. The Conseil Royal des Finances, overseeing budgets and tax policies. The nobles at Versailles, they weren't invited. Instead, many key offices went to bourgeois professionals, trained men of the robe, not the sword. Nobles were kept close but intellectually idle, too busy with etiquette and opera to worry about tax reform or foreign policy. This was not accidental. It was administrative brilliance, hiding behind powdered wigs and elaborate menus. Money bag control through money, pensions and dependency. Louis XIV mastered the use of royal pensions to bind the nobility. These were annual payments, given at the king's discretion, tied to loyalty and visibility at court. A noble might receive 10,000 livres a year, enough to fund the staff, gowns, and carriages required to look important. But without Versailles, the pension could be withdrawn. This fostered dependency, not independence. Competition, not collaboration. Display, not development. The result, a nobility with prestige but no power base, no army, and often no land management experience. They were courtiers, not governors. And the real work of ruling fell to a rising class of state bureaucrats, classical ministers, and the rise of administrative absolutism. While nobles played cards and performed bows, men like Jean-Baptiste Colbert and Michel Letellier were building the state behind the scenes. Colbert, the king's finance minister, developed detailed mercantilist policies, reorganized tax collection, built state monopolies in textiles, glass, and salt. Letellier and his son Louvois reformed the army, creating a standing force loyal to the crown. Centralized military provisioning and logistics, created military schools for officers bypassing noble families. Their loyalty was not born of bloodline, but of merit and appointment. Thus, France slowly evolved into a state where governance was professionalized, but symbolized by aristocratic display. Versailles became a screen behind which modern bureaucracy took shape, performing arts nobility as spectacle. Though powerless, the court nobility served a vital function: distraction and display. They attended masquerade balls, elaborate suppers, week-long hunting festivals, daily concerts and theatrical productions. All of it was scripted and choreographed much like the architecture of the palace itself. Clothing followed strict rules. Color codes dictated social rank. Certain accessories required royal permission. The tightness of your lace or length of your cuffs spoke volumes. To fall out of fashion was to fall out of favor. But none of it affected the king's policies. It only occupied minds, and in doing so pacified ambition, decreasing the costs beneath the surface. While Versailles glittered, France's administrative problems deepened. Taxation remained regressive. The poorest paid the most. Corvée labor forced peasants to work on roads and royal projects. Famine and debt haunted the provinces, even as fireworks lit the gardens of Versailles. Local parliaments, law courts, were often ignored. Provincial governors were bypassed, and regional grievances went unheard. The more powerful the central state became, the more remote it felt. Versailles was the physical symbol of this gap: dazzling, silent, unreachable. Brain the quiet shift in ideas. Even within Versailles, doubt began to stir. Some nobles and intellectuals grew restless. Why were they spending fortunes to hold candlesticks? Why did commoners have more influence than dukes? What had happened to the old ideals of chivalry and regional autonomy? Whispers turned to questions. Questions turned to letters. Letters became pamphlets, some smuggled out, some written abroad by exiles. The early seeds of Enlightenment skepticism found soil among those who felt useless in splendor. Though the revolution was still decades away, the emotional distance between court and country had begun to widen. And so we end this section. With the court dancing into the night, the fountains murmuring outside, and the king still playing the role of son. Yet beneath the music, a question persists. What happens when a palace becomes a prison? And can a kingdom survive when its brightest minds are reduced to spectators? Versailles was at its most magnificent around the year 1700. The palace gleamed with gold and light. The king still danced, though more slowly now, and the rituals of the court continued, as they always had, in precise, practiced harmony. But time is patient, and even a palace built for eternity cannot resist the pressure of years, of shifting minds, and of slow, inevitable decay. This final section traces the decline of Versailles' dominance, not as an architectural failure, but as an idea, a political tool that lost its effectiveness, and a symbol whose meaning began to unravel. We look at what Versailles became after Louis XIV, how it lingered into revolution, and how even now it remains one of history's most beautiful contradictions. Mantelpiece: the king grows old. By the 1710s, Louis XIV was visibly aging. He had ruled for over 70 years, longer than any European monarch before or since. His gait slowed. His appetite faded. Many courtiers who had once competed for his attention had died or withdrawn. His court continued out of habit, but it had lost its urgency. War had returned, the long and costly War of Spanish Succession. Taxes rose. Famine crept across the countryside. Public opinion shifted. The king was no longer adored. In 1715, Louis XIV died, aged 76, in the bed at Versailles that had served as the stage for his coucher and lever. And with his final breath, the palace he had created lost its son. Adult baby, the regency, and the first retreat. The throne passed to Louis XV, a child of only 5. Real power moved into the hands of Philippe d'Orléans, the regent. His first act, moved the court back to Paris. Versailles, for the first time in over 30 years, emptied. Rooms were shuttered, galleries quieted. The fountains, too expensive to maintain, were turned off for long stretches. It was as though a giant machine had gone idle. Though Versailles would later be reoccupied by Louis XV, the break revealed something important. The palace could not function without constant performance. Without ritual, it was just a very large house. Performing arts Louis XV returned to habit, not glory. When Louis XV came of age, he returned the court to Versailles, but the magic was gone. The king preferred privacy over ceremony, kept mistresses, such as Madame de Pompadour, in hidden apartments, avoided the public rituals his great-grandfather had used as instruments of control. He still used Versailles, but as a place of pleasure, not politics. New wings were added, including the charming Petit Trianon. The palace's style softened into the Rococo, favoring intimacy over grandeur. But the political effectiveness of Versailles, as a tool of absolutism, began to fade. Ministers worked increasingly from Paris. Courtiers felt alienated, and the idea of the king as a godlike figure slowly eroded into one of a man surrounded by extravagance and mistakes. Thought ballooned seeds of doubt. By the mid-1700s, Versailles had become a symbol of contradiction. It represented French sophistication, yet also waste. It inspired awe but also ridicule in Enlightenment salons. It was admired but increasingly resented. Writers like Voltaire, Diderot, and Rousseau criticized not just the monarchy, but the court's detachment from real life. Letters from foreign dignitaries described Versailles as a dream of wealth resting on the nightmare of the poor. The nobles who once clamored for an invitation now murmured dissatisfaction. The very structure that once secured loyalty had become a symbol of division. Crown Louis XVI and the final decay. By the time Louis XVI came to the throne in 1774, Versailles was already a relic. He attempted modest reforms, allowing some freedom of speech, calling the Estates General, but the structure around him remained rigid. And the people outside the palace were no longer passive. Years of bad harvests, mismanagement, and frustration culminated in the French Revolution in 1789. The king's failure to act decisively, and Versailles' continued indulgence became irreconcilable with the mood of the nation. On October 5, 1789, thousands of women marched from Paris to Versailles demanding bread. The next day, they forced the royal family to return with them to the city. They never came back. The palace was abandoned as a royal residence, not ceremoniously, but suddenly, amid chants and muskets. Versailles, the stage of absolutism, was now a silent monument to its failure. After Versailles, following the Revolution, Versailles was stripped of its furnishings. Artworks were moved to the Louvre. Rooms were repurposed, sealed, or left to decay. Under Napoleon, it was used sparingly. Later monarchs avoided it entirely. It wasn't until the 19th century that it was restored not as a royal palace, but as a museum of French history. Even today, visitors see it not as a place of power, but of memory. A gilded ghost. Globe showing Europe, Africa, Versailles in the modern world. Versailles has never entirely lost its role in world affairs. In 1919, it became the site of the Treaty of Versailles, ending World War I, a moment of ironic symmetry, where a palace once built to display dominance now served as a stage for peacemaking and, eventually, new grievances. The Hall of Mirrors hosted not a king, but diplomats. The mirrors still reflected, but now, they reflected fragility, not power. Candle final reflection, the palace that watched itself. Versailles was never just a building. It was a theater of control, where a king played God and nobles became spectators in their own political extinction. But like all theaters, its power depended on participation. When the actors questioned the script, or the audience stopped clapping, the illusion unraveled. And so Versailles teaches us something not only about monarchy, but about the architecture of authority. What is power if it must be performed to be believed? And what becomes of it when the performance ends but the walls still stand, silently remembering every line?